Welcome to the 14th Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture. It's really good to see a lot of old, familiar faces in the crowd. And I notice there's a lot of young people also, which I suspect are from the Johns Hopkins Nanying Center and from NYU. So if you can raise your hands, all the young people, and also the students from Shanghai universities. Fudan University. So allow me to make some brief remarks about the lecture series, this being the 14th iteration since the lecture series began in 2005, just as background. The lecture is meant to honor Doak Barnett and Mike Oksenberg and their contributions to Sino-American Relations. Doak and Mike were two American scholars and policymakers of distinction whose writings and actions had a powerful impact on bilateral relations dating back to the 1960s. Doak Barnett was born here in Shanghai, not far from here. In fact, his childhood home is about a kilometer and a half away just south of Changsulu. Doak had a great affection for the city of his birth. After graduating from Yale, he returned to China as a journalist. Doak went on to teach at Columbia University and Johns Hopkins University, where an entire generation of American China scholars were influenced by his voluminous teachings and writings. During the 1960s, Doak was one of the earliest voices calling for a dialogue with China despite the deep differences at that time between our two countries. His testimonies to Congress, his behind-the-scenes efforts, and his advice to people such as President Johnson helped to influence the process of changes in attitude toward China. Michael Oksenberg, in turn, was an outstanding student of Doak Barnett while getting his PhD at Columbia. Mike went on to a long and distinguished teaching career at the University of Michigan, where he raised an entire generation of scholars to understand China better. Mike eventually served in President Carter's National Security Council. At the ninth Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture in 2014 here in Shanghai, President Carter underlined the critical role Mike played in the normalization of relations. Both Doak and Mike were scholars of distinction who straddled both academia and policymaking. They both had a great admiration for China's culture, history, and traditions, yet advocated hard-headed and realistic policymaking driven by national interests. They both took a long-term view on the incredible possibility of relations between our two countries, despite the inevitable tensions arising from deeper and broader engagement. I knew both Doak and Mike, and I believe they couched their realism with a deep empathy and respect for the common humanity shared by both the American and Chinese peoples. This is something which is increasingly forgotten in today's rhetorical atmosphere. Like some of you here today, I had the privilege of studying under both Doak and Mike. And although Doak and Mike have passed, we continue to honor them, and by honoring them, we also honor the many people in both countries who strive to maintain the foundations of the relationship between the U.S. and China, even in these very trying times. The lecture format is purposely structured to be a dialogue, which includes your involvement as an audience. An American speaker's lecture, which is not pre-reviewed or edited, is commented on by a Chinese commentator, and the audience is free to ask questions in an open forum. When we established the lecture, our assumption was that the bilateral relationship would have its periods of volatility. But we also felt that engagement and frank dialogue would be an enduring requirement. This is especially true for today. Especially now in the midst of competition and engagement, finding areas of cooperation and engaging in mature, direct dialogue are even more important. And I'm sure the ambassador will speak to this in his comments. I want to recognize two people today in particular. First is the former head of the Shanghai Association of American Studies, Ding Xinghao. Now 92 years old, Ding Laoshi advocated for the lecture when it was just an idea. Ding Laoshi, can you please stand? I also want to thank Ding Laoshi's successors at the SAAS. First, Huang Renwei, who cannot be here today, and now Professor Wu Xinbo. Thank you very much. Second, I want to recognize Jan Barris, Vice President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. I call Jan the unofficial U.S. Permanent Secretary of our bilateral relations. Jan has been at the committee for over 50 years and has played a critical and tireless role in our bilateral relations. Thank you both, Ding Laoshi and Jan. We would like to thank our sponsors whose generosity made this event possible. The sponsors this year are Citibank, Coca-Cola, Keenan Ventures, DLA Piper, Delta Airlines, and Wynn Resorts. And a special thanks also to Ken Jarrett for his help in all aspects of this year's lecture. Thank you very much, Ken. We also want to particularly thank the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai for their continued support. Thank you, Eric, for your support, and their very able event team led by Karen Chu, and for their incredible work in managing all aspects of the logistics for today's event. Finally, as I said at the beginning, included in our audience are at least 70 Chinese and American students. They come from the top universities in Shanghai and also from the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Center, where American and Chinese students live and study together, discussing the difficult issues and possibilities of our complex relationship. We also have students here from NYU Shanghai and Duke Kunshan. These young people are part of the future of our relationship, as are all of you. So thank you all for your continued engagement in the future of Sino-American relations. And with that, I pass the lecture over. Thank you again for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. As Paul said, I'm Jan Barris, Vice President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and an old friend of many of you in the room. It's always nice to be here because Shanghai, the secret you can't tell other people, is actually my favorite city in China. But I usually only get here once a year for this lecture, so it's always wonderful to be here, and we appreciate all of you coming. Paul has thanked a lot of people, but one of the most important people he left out, because he's very modest, is himself. So I'm going to thank Paul and tell all of you that we would not be here today if it were not for him. He was, he's a Métis Huaran, a Chinese American, and his heart is in both countries, but in many ways I think he's a little more Chinese than he is American, because he is a very, very filial person. After his two teachers died, Doak Barnett and Mike Oksenberg, he wanted to find a way to honor them. And to me, that is a very, very Chinese thing to do. So he called me one day. I'll never forget, I was skiing in Vermont, and I came back from skiing, and there was this note that said that Paul was trying to reach me, and I called him, and he told me this idea that he had. And he said, next time you're in Shanghai, I want you to get together with me and Professor Ding-Sheng Hao, who Paul just mentioned. Paul said that he had something, to do early, advocated early on for this event, but actually it was Paul and Lao Ding and I who sat together one night and spent several hours thinking about what would be the best possible way to honor Doak and Mike, and came up with the idea for this lecture. And I'm just really pleased, and I know that Mike and Doak would be extremely pleased to know that this lecture has now gone on for so many years, and that we can fill a room with people who still want to come to hear and to talk about and to think about U.S. China relations and the nature of the relationship and how we can make it better. And that's a very important thing to do in these very difficult times. Paul also mentioned several people who are here. There are two people that I want to add to that list, and these two people also come every single year to this lecture, even though they no longer live here. It was sort of easy when they lived in Shanghai or up in Beijing, but that is Doak's grandson, James Barnett, and his wife, May. James, I know you walked in, but I don't know where you're sitting. Nephew, sorry, nephew. James and May. I hesitated for a moment there. I thought it's definitely not his son, but I got grandson instead of nephew. Sorry. One other addition I would like to make, and I'm not going to embarrass him by having him stand up, but both Paul mentioned that there are students here from several universities, and he mentioned all of them. Well, there is one more university mentioned, one other university that's represented here, and that's Shanghai Technical University. I've been in China for the past week. I first went to Guizhou and spent 4 days there talking with a lot of people about strategic security issues for a dialogue that the National Committee runs on that subject. And then I went to Beijing to meet with more people. And yesterday I took a train down from Beijing to Shanghai. And I sat next to a really lovely young man who is a graduate student at Shanghai Technical University. And he was extraordinarily helpful to me in all sorts of ways. And so I asked him if he might want to come to this today. And he's here too. So I just wanted you to know that you have a wide range of schools that are represented. And I think it is really important that we have such a strong showing from the younger generation, because they are the ones who are going to have to figure out a better way to make the relationship work than us older people who tried our best, but the relationship, is, everyone in this room knows, is a very mercurial one. It's had its ups and it has its downs. We are right now in a sort of stable down position, but hopefully there will be a meeting between our two presidents sometime this week, and hopefully that will start us on a progression of making the relationship better. And our goal at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations is to help people make that happen, make the relationship better, provide more opportunities for Americans to come to China to better understand it, and for Chinese to come to America. Because neither of us should be listening to the politicians or the media. We should come to the other country, spend time there, and make our own decisions on what is important and how we can work together for a better future. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to thank you.
Dear Mr. Paul Liu, Ms. Jan Barris, Ambassador Dan Kritenbrink, Professor Xinbo, and Professor Ding Xinhao, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Shao Yiqun. I lead the Institute for Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Cult Studies at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Today, there are 4 graduate students from SIIS also joining this audience. I'm also the Vice President of the Shanghai Association of American Studies. On behalf of this association, I'm very delighted to welcome Ambassador Kritenbrink to Shanghai as the speaker for this year's Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture on Sino-American Relations. I've already met with Ambassador twice this year, once in Washington, D.C., and once in Shanghai recently, and have had great closed-door discussions on our bilateral relations. I'm very glad that he's back in Shanghai again and would like to share his insights with a much bigger audience. The Shanghai Association of American Studies is a non-governmental organization founded in year 2000 with 120 individual members who conduct research on the U.S. economy, politics, security strategies, social issues, and of course, the development of China-U.S. relations. One of the association's missions is to increase public understanding and knowledge of the United States, and co-hosting this lecture with the National Committee on U.S. China Relations is a key part of this effort. This year marks the 14th anniversary of this lecture, and its importance in enhancing mutual understanding between the two societies has never been more important than now. China and the United States are both proudly nationalistic nations, often making it difficult for the other to understand, let alone comprehend. What they really care about is how to make their own country better, not to make enemies with each other. However, due to the pandemic and various other reasons, exchanges between the two sides, especially exchanges between think tanks and universities, are becoming increasingly difficult. This requires us to carry forward the spirit of Dirk Barnett and Mike Oksenberg, who overcame difficulties and actively promoted the normalization of China-U.S. relations, and make our due contribution to helping today's China-US relations get out of the predicament and enter a truly stable stage. We are currently at an interesting historical moment. Yesterday, the Chinese and American teams just concluded an important meeting in Malaysia. We are expecting a summit meeting between our two presidents while they are in Gwangju, South Korea, attending the APEC summit. This afternoon, I was interviewed by a German journalist who asked me if this possible summit would be symbolic or groundbreaking. I said neither. The meeting is definitely not symbolic because the summits between the two presidents have played a leading role in bilateral relations, as we have seen. However, due to the many structural problems in the bilateral relationship and the difficulty of fundamental adjustments in the Americans' perception and strategy towards China in the short term, the meeting is unlikely to be groundbreaking, and it's very likely that the bilateral relationship will further deteriorate after the summit. In the process of negotiating while confronting, China and the US are exploring both the ceiling and the floor of this bilateral relationship and gaining a new understanding of each other. Perhaps this is the new normal of our bilateral relationship. I like Ambassador Kritenbrink's speech title, Reflection on a Relationship that Shapes the World. In the 1990s, China-US relations were often characterized by the three T's: trade, Taiwan, and Tibet. As we move into the 21st century, the relationship was seen as a bilateral one with significant regional impact. Now, however, it is undeniable that this relationship will determine the future of trajectory of human society. Thus, we must engage with, research, and promote China-US relations with a sense of mission to serve the well-being of all humanity. With that, I'll hand over to Ambassador Kritenbrink for his remarks. Dan, you have 30 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends, I really just can't tell you what a tremendous honor it is to be here today for this year's Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture, and to do so here in Shanghai, a city that has long stood at the crossroads of China's engagement with the world. I want to say in particular, I'm deeply moved at this moment to see there are so many people here who still care about the U.S. China relationship at least as much as I do. And I'm particularly moved to see so many young students here today. I wish I could change places with you. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation here with you this evening. Let me begin by expressing my deep gratitude to the Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture Organizing Committee, especially the chair, Paul Leo. Paul, I don't think we've appropriately recognized you, so Paul, thank you. The vice chairs, the inimitable Jan Barris and Professor Wu Xinbo. I also want to thank my friend Dr. Xiao Yuchun, pretty much what she said. I thought that was a brilliant summation. You're going to listen to me for the next 20 minutes, but it's pretty much what she said. But Dr. Xiao, I thank you for your friendship. I thank you for your scholarship. I also want to thank our hosts, the National Committee on U.S. China Relations and the Shanghai Association of American Studies. My thanks as well to our cooperating partners, the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai and the Shanghai Institute of American Studies. This lecture series, of course, honors A. Doak Barnett and Michael Oksenberg, two scholar practitioners who helped generations of Americans and Chinese, academics, policymakers, and the public better understand one another. Reflecting on Professor Barnett's passing, Professor Oksenberg at the time wrote that his mentor, quote, brought reason to the often uncivil American debate on China policy throughout his life. Doak fought the good fight for a rational and realistic policy toward China. Years later, Oksenberg's own students recalled that Mike used his seemingly bottomless reservoir of energy to make China and America understandable to each other. And on that basis, he strove to develop realistic ties that would serve both countries. I believe those words still resonate and inspire us today. Their influence has endured through the many they mentored, scholars and officials such as Ken Lieberthal, Cui Tian Kai, Elizabeth Economy, David Xinbo, each of whom has contributed mightily to this relationship, and each of whom has taught me a great deal. I'm also particularly honored to speak tonight because my own heroes have always been educators and scholars. I grew up wanting to be a professor and somehow got distracted by a career in diplomacy, but maybe I'll make it back home someday. But like many here, I owe immense debts to my own professors. First at the University of Nebraska-Kearney, later at the University of Virginia, where I learned about China from Brantley Womack and Tony Leung. I learned about diplomacy and international relations from Ken Thompson, David Newsom, and Len Schappa. Their example, and that of Professors Barnett and Oksenberg, taught me the enduring value of scholarship informed by experience, and experience guided by scholarship. I will do my utmost to honor their legacy here this evening. Now, when Jan Barris invited me to deliver this lecture, I initially hesitated. I was humbled by the stature of those who have spoken before me, and I was daunted by the seriousness of this topic. But I agreed because of my deep respect for the National Committee and because U.S. China relations, the world's most complex yet consequential relationship, have shaped not only global affairs, but also my own 31-year diplomatic career. During our limited time this afternoon, I won't attempt to resolve the great questions that have perplexed our two countries for more than half a century. Instead, I will try to do three things, simply and I hope succinctly. Jan told me, Dr. Xiao, I only have 15 to 20 minutes, so that's my goal. But in our 15 to 20 minutes together, I will try to do three things. First, I will share 5 lessons from my decades as a U.S. diplomat working on China. Second, I will offer 5 observations on the relationship today on the eve of a summit between our two leaders in Korea. And third, I will discuss 5 thoughts and hopes for the path ahead. You can tell in great Chinese style I've come up with the 3 5s for the U.S.-China relationship. So after I deliver my 3 5s, I then look forward to Dr. Wu Xinbo's commentary and corrections and to many questions from this audience. So first, allow me to share my reflections on a diplomatic career shaped largely by U.S.-China relations. Over 3 decades in the U.S. Foreign Service, from January 1994 until January of this year, 2/3 of my career focused directly on China. From 2 years of language training, very humbling language training in the mid-2000s, to 8 years at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing with my family, to assignments as the China Desk Director, the NSC Senior Director for Asia, U.S. Ambassador to Vietnam, and Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, China was the constant thread. During my career, I witnessed our relationship evolve dramatically, becoming significantly more complex and suffering a significant downturn. I take no satisfaction in that assessment. But we have moved from an era largely defined by shared interests and cooperation, within which we managed competition and differences, to one now defined primarily by strategic competition, within which we struggle to find limited cooperation. During that same period, we've also observed China's stunning rise. Yet we've also observed the emergence of a China that is often more assertive and coercive abroad and more restrictive and suspicious at home. But with that as background, let me share with you the 5 lessons that I learned. First, the enduring importance of people-to-people ties. My earliest years at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing were doing what American political officers back then were paid to do. Talking, eating, and yes, often drinking with smart, engaging Chinese counterparts. They were scholars, journalists, students, activists, and officials, many of whom displayed courage, civility, and pride in their nation's resurgence. Those relationships, hundreds of relationships, and the insights they offered became a key foundation of my own understanding of China. I was struck by the reservoir of goodwill that many Chinese held toward the United States and by the many aspirations that we shared together, even as the legacies of China's century of humiliation and the bitterness they generated were still never far below the surface. Those experiences also reminded me always to distinguish between the great Chinese people, whose warmth and ambitions are unmistakable, and the policies of the party state. Sadly, such exchanges are harder today. The atmosphere of suspicion has chilled the informal connections that once animated our work. Yet they remain irreplaceable, and we should do everything possible to preserve them. And I still have the utmost respect for the Chinese people. Second, diplomacy matters, especially at the leader level. It will come as no shock to you, I'm a retired diplomat. I believe in talking to people. But I did learn throughout my career that I've seen both the promise and limits of diplomatic dialogue. Too often dialogue risks becoming ritual. I recall years ago when our two countries maintained more than 60 formal dialogue mechanisms, we still had few real exchanges. Dialogue must be candid and outcome-oriented. Yet while we must avoid performative interactions, it's also clear to me that the most dangerous moments in our relationship have been those of greatest tension, when communication broke down, or including sometimes because our Chinese friends went dark during a crisis to focus on their own internal coordination. However, when our leaders and our diplomats engaged candidly, privately, regularly, and strategically, we better understand one another, we reduce the risk of miscalculation, we diffuse crises, and we occasionally agree to cooperate. I've seen up close the stabilizing power of leader-level diplomacy with China, from Bush-Hu to Obama-Xi to Biden-Xi, and as I will discuss below, I believe the same dynamic clearly holds true today under the Trump presidency, perhaps more than ever before. Trust between our countries is scarce, but even limited trust between leaders and envoys can preserve the worst outcomes, place guardrails on competition, and provide leverage to conclude agreements. Leader-level diplomacy is especially important for our two systems, for China's top-down governance, as well as for a U.S. system increasingly divided on the question of how to deal with China. My third lesson: alliances and partnerships remain America's greatest strategic asset and should remain a central element of a successful U.S.-China strategy. As I rose to senior roles during my career, I realized more clearly than ever that America's alliances and partnerships are central to our security, our prosperity, and our success in dealing with China. Simply put, a sound China strategy begins with strong alliances. As the late great Ambassador Richard Armitage used to say, to get China right, the United States must get the region right. Our friends in the Indo-Pacific look to Washington not for confrontation, but for steadiness, an America that upholds a rules-based order while competing responsibly. Most partners do not wish to choose sides. They wish to preserve choice itself. That principle, strategic autonomy free from coercion, is one that all parties should respect. Sadly, many Chinese friends have misread, I think, America's alliance network as encirclement or containment, but I strongly believe it is not. Our alliances are the inheritance of the post-war order, and it's an order in which China itself has obviously prospered. Fourth, America's strength abroad depends on renewal at home. During the final decade of my career, I increasingly observed that America's ability to compete effectively with China rests not on our delivery of speeches or démarches in our respective capitals, but on the resilience of our economy, the deterrence of our military, the vitality of our democracy, and the unity of our people. We should focus less on persuading China to change and more on proving that our own system works, that our economy remains innovative, our governance effective, and our commitments to the region enduring. For Chinese friends convinced of U.S. decline, I would simply say there have been many moments in previous decades when America's staying power in Asia had been doubted, and in each case, those predictions have been wrong. My fifth and final lesson is that competition between our two countries will only intensify, especially in technology. But our primary task is to manage this competition responsibly. If there's one thing I learned over the course of my career, it is, again, that rivalry and competition between our two countries will continue to grow. But we must do all we can to minimize the risk of miscalculation that can lead to conflict. Particularly since Beijing's announcement of Made in China 2025, the race to shape the industries of the 21st century has become the central arena, perhaps, of our competition. Both nations seek prosperity and security. Neither will easily yield leadership. Of course, this is not the only realm for our competition. We're faced with a host of long-standing disagreements and issues such as peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and in the East and South China Seas, to differences over human rights. These issues have been there for a long time. None of that will change anytime soon. But what I have learned, again, I will reiterate, that our primary task should be to ensure that this competition remains responsible and peaceful. Let me now turn to the extraordinary moment in which we find ourselves today and the anticipation surrounding the expected meeting between our two leaders on the margins of APEC in Gyeongju, South Korea. Here, too, I would offer 5 observations. First, this has been an unprecedentedly tumultuous year in U.S. China relations. One that has taken us from a tariff war to a supply chain war to now a tentative search for stability. The Trump administration's efforts to use primarily tariffs to reindustrialize the United States, reshore critical supply chains, and reduce the trade deficit have been met by assertive Chinese countermeasures. After the two sides essentially fought this tariff and supply chain war to a standstill, diplomacy has resumed, and an uneasy truce has emerged, anchored by discussions between Treasury Secretary Besson and Vice Premier He Lifeng, and by phone calls between President Trump and President Xi. Now, on the eve of our two presidents meeting in Korea, both sides profess a desire to stabilize the relationship. Yet I think recent events underscore just how fragile this search for stability remains. The United States' new 50% rule on technology exports and China's sweeping global rare earths licensing regime illustrate how easily tactical actions can reignite strategic mistrust. In recent conversations with officials in both capitals, one hears the same refrain. Each side felt aggrieved. Each side believed it had been wronged and betrayed. Yet, despite that bitterness, it's been striking to me how quickly both sides de-escalated the situation over the past 2 weeks. And based on the news overnight, the framework that has reportedly been agreed to yesterday by Secretary Besson and Vice Premier He in Kuala Lumpur is quite positive. And based on that, it appears that the meeting between our two presidents will in fact go forward, and will go forward in a relatively positive atmosphere. I think what we'll need to watch, however, is whether this framework is going to be implemented now, or whether it will serve primarily as the basis for negotiations over the next 12 months, when it's reported that President Trump will visit China early next year, and hopefully President Xi will visit the United States in late 2026. Third, in this tense environment, I believe that leader-level diplomacy remains essential, perhaps more than ever before. As I've noted, historically, personal engagement between our presidents has played a key role in managing the bilateral relationship. I think it's been that way since 1972. Stabilization appears likely to be the top priority coming out of the Korea meeting, just as the June 5 and September 19 Trump-Xi phone calls lowered tensions and outlined a diplomatic calendar for the months ahead. But it is clear to me that both sides also want concrete outcomes. For the U.S., the president has focused on commercial purchases, especially of agricultural products, fentanyl, supply chains, and TikTok. For Chinese friends, they're reportedly looking at relaxation of U.S. tech and investment restrictions, tariff relief, and a reaffirmation of the U.S. One China policy, and perhaps more. Beyond whatever deliverables may be announced now versus those saved for later visits, I believe the key is to use these channels to prevent the relationship from devolving into a test of wills. Fourth, despite this flurry of diplomacy, the structural drivers of competition and suspicion will not change anytime soon. Both sides approach the other with considerable confidence. Each side believes the other needs it more. Each side thinks it holds escalation dominance. I have to say, though, based on my travels to China just over the last month, it is quite striking to me how confident Beijing has become and the strength of China's growing belief that it has the ability to manage Washington, shaped by lessons from the first Trump administration, namely that Beijing has learned that swift tit-for-tat responses command respect. And many Chinese friends continue to believe that China can eat bitterness longer than Americans can. And finally, expectations of what this diplomacy can achieve must remain realistic. Any agreement this year, even at the presidential level, will likely deliver tactical stabilization, not a strategic transformation. The deeper forces shaping this relationship, divergent systems, mutual suspicion, global ambition, will continue to fuel competition. Yet, even incremental progress toward predictability is valuable when mistrust runs so high. And tactical stabilization is obviously preferable to an out-of-control trade war. Now, having reflected on past lessons and the current moment, let me close by offering 5 thoughts and hopes for the U.S. China relationship going forward. First, we must accept and responsibly manage a primarily competitive relationship between our two countries. As I've noted, competition between the U.S. and China is structural, not temporary. We should not apologize for this, and in fact, I think we should embrace this fact. But at the same time, we must manage and channel this competition productively, ensuring that rivalry does not slide into hostility, miscalculation, or conflict. I was deeply struck last year in a meeting while I was still a U.S. diplomat. It was a meeting in Beijing with a very senior Chinese official in which he said, "Perhaps that is the best that we can do." I believe it likely is, and it certainly is the most important thing that we can do. But if maintaining open channels and avoiding miscalculation and conflict is the best that we can do, then we must do it exceptionally well. That is our responsibility. Second, I believe and hope that China should show that it can wield power responsibly. When I was Assistant Secretary, a foreign minister of a major regional country declared that the challenge posed by China is that China has weaponized much of its external engagements to advance its national interests in increasingly aggressive ways. I therefore believe that China's challenge is to demonstrate that its rise contributes to regional stability, not unease. And Chinese friends should not be surprised when countries around the region and the world, including the United States, react with concern, such as when Beijing unveils a global rare earths licensing regime. Third, the U.S. must build its sources of strength both at home and with its allies and partners. As I've argued above, America's credibility abroad begins with coherence at home. When we invest in innovation, education, and infrastructure, we compete from a position of confidence. And when we coordinate with allies and partners, we amplify that strength through collective action. I think those are the keys to effectively competing with China. Fourth, I will reiterate, diplomacy will remain indispensable despite its limits. Our channels of communication, including at the presidential level, have repeatedly proven their value in clarifying intentions, diffusing crises, and creating space for cooperation. Diplomacy will not eliminate competition, but it can prevent it from becoming catastrophe. And fifth, we must preserve people-to-people and business ties. Our nations remain deeply interdependent. Bilateral trade is still roughly $700 billion annually. Even as our competition, including in economic and tech sectors, intensifies, we take steps to defend our interests and our companies. We must never allow strategic rivalry to harden into enmity between our peoples, or give in to the temptation to include restrictions on people-to-people ties as a source of asymmetrical leverage in a no-holds-barred competition. I still believe that the foundation of any relationship, including this one, is built on the links between our peoples. We must protect that. And that is why I think the work of organizations such as the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, the Shanghai Institute of American Studies, and others is more vital than ever before. So in conclusion, the relationship between the United States and China will remain the world's most consequential and complex, marked by rivalry, but also by the inescapable reality that neither of us is going anywhere, neither of us will force the other into submission, and we should not try. Even as we embrace our intensifying competition, we are not doomed to fatalistic acceptance of a Thucydides trap. The future of U.S. China relations will be shaped not by fate, but by choices, namely our choices. The spirit of Barnett and Oksenberg urges us to choose reason over rhetoric, realism over dogma, as we pursue, again, and I quote, a rational and realistic policy towards China and develop realistic ties that would serve both countries. That wisdom, I believe, resonates now more than ever. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, Dr. Wu. I look forward to your comments and to the audience's questions. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, for your excellent speech. You mentioned your education background. I understand you haven't got a PhD, and if you continue to work on your speech, and that qualify you for a PhD, maybe at Fudan University sometime in the future. Okay, I would love to. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the annual event, the Dr. Barnett-Oksenberg Lectureship. And this lecture has been held over the last, how many years? Maybe 14, 15 years in Shanghai, and it has become an important symbol of the city's commitment to understanding between China and the United States, as well as the commitment to enhancing bilateral relations. I think Dan covered a lot of areas based on his experience of working in the U.S. government in the last 31 years, I remember. I mean, I got to know him when he was working for the Obama administration at the China desk, and then followed by the Trump administration, as well as the Biden administration. So he basically saw both the good old days as well as the bad days as we are confronting today. Now let me start. I didn't have the chance to read his speech in advance, but let me try to comment on the three key words he mentioned in his speech. First is competition. He keeps emphasizing that competition is a structure, feature of bilateral relations today. Not a very long time ago, when we talk about China-US relations, on both sides, we would say this is a mixture of both cooperation and competition. But then suddenly studied from Donald Trump's first administration, when they talk about China-US relations, only competition and cooperation or coordination disappeared. And the rhetoric has been resonated again and again by the Biden administration and now by Trump's second administration. So I keep explaining to my students in class why suddenly the U.S. changed its definition of relations with China, largely because they were shocked, surprised, and unwilling to accept the rise of China. So they decided they should switch from engaging to competition as the effective way to forestall the rise of China. Let me be very frank. I mean, today when we keep talking about competition, I think U.S. didn't benefit that much in the last 7 or 8 years by emphasizing only competition in relation with China, because competition doesn't really promote the U.S. competitiveness, even though it believes the other way around. And also, when we talk about competition, let's always remember that in dealing with China, cooperation is still there, like it or not, in bilateral context, in a multilateral context. So what's important today is not that we should manage the competition, but more importantly, we should pay due attention to the necessity of promoting cooperation in bilateral relations. We need a more balanced more rational approach to this relationship. Emphasizing too much on competition will only get better relations, derail from the right track. So that's the first key word I want to comment on, competition. Second is about alliance. Dan mentioned in his speech that alliance is very important to U.S. China strategy. And alliance is not intended to deal with China. Well, if we look at the policy behavior on the part of the U.S. when it comes to its alliance in this region, I think alliance has been used as a very important leverage in U.S. strategy towards China. Let's be frank and honest that U.S. has found alliance as a very important strategic asset in dealing with China, especially on the security front, but more and more on the economic front when it comes to technology control or the sanction of Chinese entities. So alliance is important to the U.S., but I think gradually U.S. should realize the limit of the leverage in dealing with China. Because today, I just came back from a trip to Southeast Asia. I can tell that U.S. allies and partners in this region are now very suspicious of the U.S. under Donald Trump administration. Not only because they suffered from the U.S. tariffs, but also they are more and more skeptical of the U.S. Commitment to its security presence in this region and also to its security protection of allies. So even though people still say alliance is very important to U.S.-China strategy, I think its utility is declining rather than increasing, not because of China, but because of U.S. policy towards its allies and partners. The third key word I want to comment on is about diplomacy. As a career diplomat, I can understand why Dan keeps emphasizing the importance of diplomacy in relation with China. And I agree. I mean, in the last several decades, skillful and successful diplomacy played a very important role in managing this relationship in times of change and turbulence. But today, if we look at Donald Trump's China policy, if he has a policy, I think he is very much issue specific. If he cares about trade, he thinks about tariffs. If he cares about fentanyl issue, he thinks about tariffs. If he thinks about rare earth issue, he thinks about tariffs. I mean, basically, that is a issue-specific, issue-oriented diplomacy. And let's remember, in the late Biden administration, we had around 20 dialogue mechanisms between two countries, right? 16. 60. No, I mean in the Biden administration. Maybe around 20, yeah. In the good old days, 60 or even more. But even in Biden era, we had, almost 20. Today, we had only one, that's trade and economic talks. No diplomatic dialogue, no security dialogue, no dialogue between law enforcement agencies between two sides, no dialogue mechanism with regard to, people-to-people exchanges, which Dan has just emphasized on. So the problem is, this is an administration that it doesn't believe in the value of diplomacy. So even the Chinese side has pushed again and again for strategic communication. It's not happening. It's not happening. Now, when the two leaders are going to meet, we haven't seen any significant diplomatic coordination between two sides, so far as we know. So that is very rare compared with the history of this relationship in the last several decades. So I think Dan, as a career diplomat, And to some extent, I mean, certainly he has contributed a lot to this relationship through his hard work of the last decades. I don't think he would believe now this is the right time, to talk about the importance of diplomacy in bilateral relations, because the reality is that people in Washington, in White House, are not paying much attention to this topic. Now, Dan just offered 5 points as a reflection on current China-US relations. Let me try to match that with my 5-point reflection as a way to complement, not to supplement his remarks, based on my reading of U.S. China policy since the first Trump administration. The first point is that trying to slow down or even to stop China's development through competition, containment, suppression, whatever it is, will not work. At the most, you may slow down China's development in the short term, but not in the long term. Dan just mentioned his impression, during his recent trip to China. That is, the Chinese side has become more confident, because after suffering in the short term in the last several years, now we realize maybe the so-called competition from the U.S. side is a good thing for China in the long run, because we have to emphasize more on indigenous innovation. We have to emphasize more on domestic consumption, and we have to pay more attention to developing trade and economic ties with global South countries, etc. So I think competition, when it first came out, people clearly said this is a window opportunity for the U.S. to win the competition with China. Now, 7 or 8 years after this, I think it is very clear that U.S. cannot expect to stop China's development through competition. Second point is that containing or suppressing China will not help promoting the U.S. competitiveness. After all, the U.S. has to invest domestically to improve itself. And to some extent, I think because of the destructive competition with China, it hurts the U.S. competitiveness in many ways. Let me give one example. If I'm in charge of the U.S. policy, one thing I want to do with China is to get China's assistance in improving the U.S. infrastructure, which is, so poor, so outdated. It's just making the U.S. look like a third world country. Without a modern infrastructure, how can you develop everything, including manufacturing capacity? So, but the U.S. is too much, influenced by the concept of competition. So it doesn't want to trade with China. It doesn't want to, get the Chinese investment in China. It doesn't want to cooperate with China in green technology and other areas in which China is already leading ahead of the U.S. So I think in this way, this kind of, destructive competition doesn't hurt China, but hurts the U.S. The third point is that after this year's trade war, I think it's very clear to Washington that the U.S. has to rely on China. Decoupling from China is unrealistic. Trump always believed that the entire world would rely on the U.S. market. On the other hand, in a globalized economy, world economy, the U.S. also relies on other countries, especially China, for the supply chain. The U.S. cannot walk away from the commodities that China sells to the U.S., not to say the rare earths and crucial minerals. So if the U.S. tries to decouple from China, it's only end up hurting its own economy. I think that is very obvious from the recent trade war between two countries. Next, number 4, the U.S. does not just need to cooperate with China on the economic front. It also needs to cooperate, needs China's cooperation in diplomatic area and security areas, bilaterally, regionally, and globally. Dan, as a career diplomat, I trust he understood the value of cooperation with China on many regional and international issues, even though he intentionally not to emphasize this in his speech. But I think from his bottom heart, he should understand the importance of this issue. And I understand on Thursday, when two leaders meet in South Korea, President Trump, of course, he will pay a lot of attention to bilateral trade and economic issues. But I bet he will bring up issues, regional and global issues, that the U.S. would seek China's cooperation. So that is not something, you know, if you ignore it, it wouldn't exist. It always exists there. You cannot simply ignore or neglect it. Last but not least is confrontation with China over Taiwan or other issues. The risk is too high. The price is unaffordable to the U.S. There are still people in Washington who believe that it's worthwhile fight China over Taiwan as part of its grand strategy. I think the U.S., some people come to realize that is a nightmare for the U.S. The U.S. has no chance to win a conflict with China over Taiwan issue. And the price will be too high, the cost will be unaffordable. And if we look at the U.S. allies in this region, I guess no single U.S. ally or partner would support the U.S. if the U.S. is going to get involved in a conflict with China over the Taiwan issue. So I think that is a bottom line that two leaders, when they meet, they should not only talk about trade and economic issues, but most importantly, the Taiwan issue. So I think I had expected Dan to share with us, you know, some of his thoughts about, you know, how to successfully managing, you know, Taiwan issue under very challenging circumstances of bilateral relations. But I guess, you know, in Washington, maybe a rational voice is simply politically incorrect. But this is a very issue I really worry about. Think about all the problems in bilateral relations. I think this is the only issue that will bring our two countries to a head-on conflict, and which will have broader ramifications for the region and for the world. So every time when we talk about China-U.S. relations, we should always remember Taiwan is the single most important issue in this relationship. With that, I will stop here. Thank you.
Great speech and great comment, as always. So now we will start the Q&A session.
My name is Charlotte. I'm visiting from the U.S. this semester, studying at NYU Shanghai, but originally at Duke in the U.S. My question is about people-to-people diplomacy. As Ambassador Kritenbrink noted repeatedly, diplomatic and people-to-people engagements are of utmost importance, but have limits and ceilings on the effectiveness of this form of diplomacy. So how do we institutionalize these mechanisms and these working groups so that they can withstand both the political swings of both domestic systems, but also swings in the stability of the relationship itself? And is this even a possible task? Excuse me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Did you say your name was Charlotte? Thank you very much. Look, I think you probably heard through my comments, I'm a true believer in people-to-people diplomacy, people-to-people ties. You know, in part because I benefited from the power of exchange and educational exchange. When I was a young person, maybe around your age, grew up in the great state of Nebraska, grew up on a small farm in the great state of Nebraska, and somehow
in the middle of a very agricultural, sparsely populated state. Discovered the broader world because professors who believed in me decided to give me an opportunity to study abroad in Japan. And that was one of the early life-changing experiences for me that taught me the importance of really understanding other people's, other countries' cultures and languages. I mentioned to you my experience here as a diplomat when, my first assignment, I was working for the great Susan Thornton, one of the best American diplomats I've ever known, a great boss, and a former speaker.
Former Barnett-Oksenberg speaker.
I was very early in my tenure, and she came to me and she said, I didn't hire you to manage your inbox. So get off your backside, go out and start meeting with people and actually understand something about this country, and then write something to Washington to teach them as well. So those are just a couple of experiences. If we don't have those experiences, then I will be incredibly pessimistic about the future of our relationship together. I don't have any magic solution for how to institutionalize this, but what I do think is that we collectively have to stand up and say that these exchanges are important. No matter what's happening between our governments, our peoples have to understand one another. They have to respect one another. I mentioned that I studied under the late, great David Newsom at the University of Virginia. He was one of America's finest diplomats. He talked about diplomacy is based on relationships of trust and mutual respect. But I think people-to-people diplomacy is also based on trust and mutual respect. And only when we meet as human beings together can we discover what we have in common. And only if we trust one another and respect one another can we have really blunt conversations like the one that Dr. Wu and I are having here today. And I think sometimes we can't wait for our leaders or our governments to figure that out as well, even as we try to encourage them not to take steps to limit those exchanges. I hope that our peoples will continue to engage in those activities no matter what. So look, I commend you for coming here. I'm sure it's been a great experience. I certainly hope it has. That we need more of that, not less. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. We should start by ourselves. So although I was interrogated when I visited the United States in past June, I am planning my next visit to the States now. So let's do it together. Okay, next question or comment.
Can I just add one thing to
this
that?
is your business here.
Yeah, because that's something that at the committee we think about constantly. And Charlotte, I would say that you and your friends who are here studying, you have a role to play in that. When you go back home, you need to tell your teachers, the administrators at your university, your neighbors, your friends at your church or your synagogue, or wherever you find people who will listen to you about your experience and how those affected you and how they have changed your life, perhaps as Dan's experience in Japan changed his. Because our leaders have to hear from those of us who have actual on-the-ground experiences. The media, who no longer, neither American media is in China and there are no Chinese media in America, and so people just, in these days of fake news, make things up. And our leaders are now having very contentious views of one another. So it has to be the people themselves who've had these experiences. It's incumbent on you. We want to charge you with going back home and talking to people about what you learned and how important it is for others to come here and learn, and vice versa. And apologies to you on behalf of the American people for what you had to experience at the airport. I would say that both of our governments are guilty in not trusting the exchange relationship and causing too much mafan at our borders when we're letting the other people in. So, Charlotte, jayo.
Okay, thank you, Jen. We need to 不怕麻烦. Okay, so next, okay, I saw my Professor Xin Changwei. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Xiang Xin from Center for American Studies at Fudan University, and Professor Wu is my boss. And I just want to raise a question because I agree with what Professor Wu just now has talked about the Taiwan issue. Of course, not only because he's my boss. I agree with that. I think most of the people in this room, we know Taiwan issue is the most dangerous structural problem between the two sides. And we noticed that last month, AIT issued a kind of statement, start to challenge the Cairo Declaration and Potsdam Proclamation, and also to challenge the UN Resolution 2758. I think it's a kind of a new movement made by the US government. Could you tell me your interpretation of such a kind of behavior and what's the intention or the implication of that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I assume that's directed at me. Let me say two things. Well, I'll probably say more than that, but at the outset. First, I'm no longer a U.S. diplomat. I retired in January this year. I'm now a partner at the Asia Group, where we try to help companies succeed in Asia and help Asian companies succeed in the United States. But I'll try to speak candidly based on my past experience and my understanding of what I think is going on. I haven't been in the government since January, so I don't know exactly why that statement was made at that time. But here's what I would say on the issue of Taiwan and cross-strait relations. I think the great wisdom of our forefathers at the time of normalization was to advance common understanding between the United States and China as much as possible. On the Taiwan issue, we could only get so far. I think we did share certain understandings, and based on those understandings, we were able to, under President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger, we were able to open a path toward normalization, and under President Carter, we were able to normalize. But the reality is, because there were certain fundamental differences that remained between the U.S. and China over the question of Taiwan, very clever diplomats on both sides came up with sufficiently clear yet vague language that we both respectively call our one China policy. You call it the one China principle, we call it the U.S. one China policy. The reality is that that language and that formulation masks the fact that our countries don't fully agree on the situation. But what we did agree, essentially, being informal here, essentially we agreed to put that issue on the shelf, and that over time, that issue would be resolved. That would be my shorthand informal summary of the issue. I remember when I first started working on the U.S. China relationship in recognition of how sensitive that issue was, I was given a laminated card with America's one China policy on it. And I was told that if I ever said any word about Taiwan that was not on that card, I would get fired. That's a recognition that our one China policy is rather complex, somewhat sensitive, but I think it proves the point. I think what your American friends think, and what I thought when I was in the government, is that Chinese friends are increasingly dissatisfied with that status quo and increasingly dissatisfied with the ambiguity around those issues. So most of your American friends, particularly those in the government, believe that China is trying to push and alter that status quo through a series of measures. So when I saw the statement by AIT on UN Security Council Resolution 2758 on the Cairo and Potsdam declarations, I wasn't involved in that decision. I'm now a private American citizen working for a private company. But the way I interpreted it was, in recent years, Chinese friends have become much more aggressive about pushing their interpretation of UN Security Council Resolution 2758 in Cairo and Potsdam. I think you would probably argue your position has not changed over the years on that. I think I would agree with that. But I do think Chinese friends have been more aggressive about pushing that issue to try to make progress from Beijing's perspective on Taiwan. And I think your American friends are pushing back by saying, here's our interpretation of those events. It's different from yours, so don't use that language to try to upend the status quo. That's what I think is going on. But here's what I would also say. This issue is very complex. It's incredibly emotional, particularly for friends on the mainland. I think it's emotional for friends in Taiwan, emotional for many of your American friends as well. I still think we are better off when we stick to the wisdom of our forefathers and continue to embrace the status quo and the ambiguity of our one China policies. And I think that is the recipe for peace and stability going forward. But that is the American perspective that I think I can share with some confidence. But I'm not speaking on behalf of the U.S. government, but that's my view of what I think is going on. I don't necessarily expect you to be convinced of that, but I hope you'll understand that that's what many American friends are doing. I think many American friends are worried that China over time may be willing to use non-peaceful means to solve the cross-strait issue. I think your American friends believe, let's preserve the status quo and peace and stability, and this is an issue that will be resolved in the future.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, please. You have to
I
say
have
something.
to jump into this issue. I mean, Dan just mentioned in the past, as diplomats, they had to be very cautious in talking about Taiwan issue. So this kind of sensitivity shaped the U.S. approach to this issue for a long time after normalization. And Taiwan, was not a major issue actually in Pacific region for many years until very recently. Not because the mainland, tried to pursue the reunification agenda, because that has been our constant policy all the years. What's changing, in my understanding, is that in Washington, people began to rethink about Taiwan issue in the broader context of strategic competition with China. To put it the other way, some people are rediscovering Taiwan's strategic value to the U.S. in its competition with China. And it began to, move back on its Taiwan policy. So including challenging this kind of historical protocols, documents regarding Taiwan's status as one part of China. I think that's something making the Chinese side not only very upset, but very vigilant. I think one thing the U.S. friends should bear in mind, as long as we still care about U.S. positions on Taiwan issue, that's a good sign. That we still take the U.S. Factor into account when we think about Taiwan issue. However, if one day we just ignore the U.S. factor, we don't care what U.S. Taiwan policy is, that may not be a good thing for the U.S. on the Taiwan issue.
Thank you.
I normally pledge if I want to have a productive conversation with Chinese friends not to talk about Taiwan. You can tell because it's still very sensitive. I would just say this. I do know from the American position, peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait is vitally important, I think, for the region, for the world, for U.S. China relations. I think we should focus on the status quo. We should probably talk less about 2758 in Cairo and Potsdam, and I think if we do that, we'll probably be better off. But I would say for the young students in the audience, if you care about U.S. China relations, you should probably study the history of the Taiwan issue because it will continue to remain vitally important going forward.
I agree with Dan's point that the Taiwan question is very emotional for all of the Chinese people. But I would say that the Chinese leadership has made our policy and adopted our policy, implement our policy with great strategic patience. Taipei, Beijing, and Washington have different understanding of the so-called status quo. Right now, it's the DPP authorities have, their policy towards the mainland China has been very provocative. So Chinese mainland policy has been tried to deter DPP authorities' policy and try to stop the United States to send wrong message to Taiwan. And I agree with the young people should learn history about the Taiwan question. And also, I think it's very important for Washington now to have the real experts on China and also on the history of the Taiwan question, so order to avoid kind of a mistake that Secretary Bessent made about our Vice Minister Li Chenggang. Okay, next question or comment. I think I should give this side. In the middle, the gentleman, yes.
Thank you. I'm David. I'm an alumni from Fudan University. I have a question for both Ambassador and Professor Wu. If you swap your position or advisor, means if Ambassador you advise leadership of China, central government, like our president, and Professor Wu you advise President Trump, and purely based on the interests of the country, what is the one difference that you would advise the government to do very differently from now? And based on their interests, so Ambassador based on China interests, that you advise like our president do very differently on foreign policy, and Professor Wu based on U.S. interests, you advise one thing for the government to do very differently.
Can I just say that's the best question I've ever heard? That is brilliant. Thank you.
Well, my job is easy. If I'm going to advise President Trump, I will say, well, Mr. President, if you are serious in making America great again, let's fix relations with China, switching from competition to cooperation. Because today, only through cooperation with China, we can only improve our infrastructure, we can only reinvigorate our manufacturing capacity, we can only stabilize our financial system, and we can only deal with the drug issue that has plagued many people and households. And only by doing that, we can seek China's cooperation in dealing with regional and global issues, including climate change that you may not like, but that's something is really happening. So my job is easy, changing the keyword, shaping the U.S. policy with China from competition to cooperation. And then we will have a really win-win situation going forward.
Really, I think your question is a brilliant one. I'll just give you a reaction on the spot. I think well, if I were really in that situation, maybe I wouldn't give this advice, but this is what I really think. I would advise Chinese leaders and Chinese friends, maybe not to push as hard. Maybe, let me explain. Maybe not promote wolf warrior diplomacy, and maybe think about the way that China is perceived overseas, and maybe consider that sometimes a softer and friendlier approach may be more successful in the long run. I mentioned that it was so profoundly impactful for me when, in my first few years here in China, I had the opportunity to meet regularly with Chinese friends, or as I said, to get paid to eat and drink with smart Chinese friends. And I learned, as I heard from Dr. Wu today as well, that many Chinese friends, I think, are convinced that the United States and the Western world wants to keep China down, that we can't stand to see China succeed, that somehow we want to continue this, this sense of agreement from the center of humiliation. And what I would say to you in all sincerity is I don't think that's what the United States is about at all. I think most Americans believe that we as a country, as a society, our companies, our universities, our government even, have invested heavily in China's success and China's rise. So I would probably advise Chinese leaders and diplomats to think about that. That if you take your diplomat hat off or your government official hat off and you try instead to put on the cap of an academic and be objective about it, I think history would teach us anytime a country rises very rapidly and has new influence, that automatically creates a reaction. I think that's what's happening today. And we'll have different perspectives on that, and you can debate whether you like that or not, or whether you agree with that or not, but that does happen. So I would just say I would encourage Chinese diplomats to think more about that when friends abroad raise concerns about something that China has done or the impact of Chinese economic policies or foreign policies. That doesn't mean that that person or that country wants to keep China down. Probably means that that person or that country has a legitimate concern that it wants to raise. And the best conversations I have ever seen between our leaders and our diplomats were conversations like that, where there were no cameras, complete privacy, and complete honesty, trying to take out emotion and being objective. That would be my appeal. That's probably hopelessly naive and idealistic, but that would be my advice.
Thank you. We have 3 minutes left. So for the last question or comment, so I will have the gender balance. So I will pick a lady. Okay, the lady in the middle, yes.
Thank you, Professor Wu and Ambassador Kritenbrink. I'm a PhD candidate at Fudan University, and I have a question for the ambassador. So about the strategic competition, I think Trump initiated the trade war in 2018, and then the Biden administration launched technological sanctions, for example, on 5G, AI, and semiconductors. So since the U.S. government created such strategic competition, and how and why would you think that they should manage the problems that created by themselves? So I would like to hear your perspectives. Thank you.
Okay, I get to go first this time. Well, again, this is why I think dialogue is so important, because I think for many of your American friends, I think many of them would say the U.S. didn't start this strategic competition. And again, I'm not trying to play a blame game here. I'm just saying, you know, I have so many great conversations with Chinese friends over the years, and I would say, you know, my friends, you know, I read your leaders' speeches. You know, I try to read the Renmin or Bao, at least I used to. I try to read the Huanqiu Shi Bao every day, even though it makes my blood pressure escalate. And what I would say is that in reading those policies and those statements, it's very clear to your American friends that China has had a competitive approach to the United States from the beginning, that China viewed the U.S. in very complex ways, some positive, some negative, but certainly in very competitive ways. And I think that the competition with the United States really spurred China to action. So I think probably the majority view on the U.S. side would be that the United States, both the government, the business community, academia, were responding to, in our view, competitive actions from China that we thought were unfair. And therefore, we were taking steps to wake up to that reality and deal with that. So I know that Dr. Wu a little while ago said that he saw America's embrace of this competitive relationship between the United States and China shows that American friends can't stand to see China succeed. I don't know a single American who thinks like that. I do know a lot of Americans who believe that now that China has risen to a place where you know, China has certain stature and influence, that China is using that influence. And I think many American friends would believe that while China deserves the credit for its rise and the Chinese people and the success it's had, I think your American friends would say we think some of that was probably done unfairly. If you ask some of the American companies who have invested here, or companies whose you know, intellectual property rights and the like have been acquired or stolen over the years. So those are just examples. So when you ask me, how can America fix the mistakes it's made and fix the strategic competition that it started, what I would say is, I wouldn't say, no, you started it first, no, you started it first. I wouldn't say that. I would just simply say, the other side always has a perspective. I hear your perspective, and I respect it. I fundamentally believe that you sincerely believe that. I just want you to understand that there are many American friends in and out of government who believe that China has taken steps that were harmful to the United States and unfair to the United States. We'd love to see China succeed. We just don't want it to be right at our, to our detriment. So, and we can debate who's right and who's wrong, but the reality is both sides fundamentally believe that. And that's the challenge that I think we have to manage. That's why I mentioned a little while ago, I think dialogue like this is so important. That's why I believe diplomacy is important. I don't disagree with everything that Dr. Wu said, but I do disagree with a couple of things. Whether you like the style of diplomacy underway right now between the US and China or not, there's still diplomacy. Our leaders are going to meet, and I'm glad they're going to meet. I would say the relationship between our two presidents and the diplomacy between them is probably the best thing going in U.S.-China relations right now. And it's the single greatest contributor of stability to the U.S.-China relationship. That's very traditional. And the fact that both sides want something out of that diplomacy and are working hard to get it, I think is a good thing. I was asked by Bloomberg today, who got the better end of the deal in Kuala Lumpur? Who won and who lost? And I politely said, I don't agree with the question. Neither side would have agreed to this meeting if we didn't think it was in our interest. So it's pretty clear to me that both sides are getting what they wanted. Not everything they wanted. That's diplomacy. My professor, Ken Thompson, once said to me, if you want to understand international relations, he said, go talk to my wife. If you want to understand realism, yeah, talk to my spouse. And I sort of feel that way as well. Neither side gets exactly what they want. That's life. That's diplomacy. I think it's a great thing our leaders are meeting. I hope it's a successful meeting. I hope we have a schedule of meetings between our presidents in the year ahead, because I think that gives us the best option for stability and certainty and cooperation in the year ahead. Thank you.
Well, when Dan says he doesn't believe, when he said no single American would think of holding China down, well, I said, well, sometimes diplomats, they have to speak diplomatically. Check with people like Matt Pompeo or some colleagues, Pompeo, etc. I think the real question is, teaching international relations at the university, I always tell my students that competition is a norm in international relations. Countries are inclined to compete with each other, very normal. But there is a competition, there is a difference between competitions. When China said, I want to learn from the US, I want to catch up with the US, I want to narrow the gap with the US by improving myself, by increasing my capability. That's what we call the benign competition, constructive competition. You keep improving yourself. Another way of competition is trying to, keep the other side down, trying to damage the other side. So if you look what happened after Donald Trump during his first term come up with the notion of strategic competition with China, it was followed by unprecedented tariffs on China, by advertising technology control over China, by ever increasing sanctions against Chinese entities, by more and more military pressure on China. That is now what we call the benign constructive competition. That doesn't have actually enhanced the U.S. competitiveness, as I just mentioned in my comment. So yes, competition is normal, but there are differences between different kinds of competition. What upsetting to the Chinese side is that some people in the U.S. they believe the only way for the U.S. to win is not so much to improve itself, but rather to keep China down. I think that's the problem.
Just one final comment. I would say we Americans like to think we're capitalists. We love competition. We just want it to be fair. So, Dr. Ruakiri, I think, but again, to go to the young lady's question, many friends in the United States think that the competition over the last couple of decades has been unfair. And that's why you're seeing the response from the United States. Now, some Chinese friends will say, see, that shows the Americans can't stand to see China succeed. I still, sorry, I know very few people who think that way. I do know a lot of Americans who think that China's form of competition has been unfair. So now we both think the other side has been unfair, right? And we demonstrated that here today. So what are we going to do about it? It's going to be your responsibility and ours to have this kind of exchange to try to understand one another better. And if we understand one another better, then we have a chance. But I would also say, I mentioned a moment ago, it made me kind of sad to say this. I've delivered a lot of demarches, hundreds of thousands of them probably. I don't think that's going to solve the issue. But, you know, dialogue is part of it. And then our two countries have to do the best we can. But I do agree, we don't want to have zero-sum competition. I think we can both succeed. That's my hope.
Okay, under the great leadership of John Barris, I announce we have 10 more minutes for Q&A. I just saw one hand over there. So do you still want to, yeah. Okay, yeah, that one. Please identify yourself, yeah.
Yes, so my name is Gabriel, and I'm part of the student delegation from the Nanjing Hopkins Center. And thank you for this opportunity. I thank you for reminding us about like the importance of trust and people-to-people connections. But I had a question that maybe you, in the meantime, more or less already answered, and it was about like what many commentators say as being like a very problem, a big issue in the U.S. China relations, that is about like a mismatch in expectations between the two sides. So I think an event like this, an exercise like this one today, help us like understand, help like the two sides understand better each other, of course. But what do you think remains of that challenge in like this mismatch in expectations, and also what maybe the leaders in South Korea or in the future can do to maybe overcome this challenge? Thank you.
No, I think it's a very thoughtful point. And I would also say that the issues we're discussing here, I think maybe they're more serious, maybe they're more pointed because the stakes are so high between the United States and China. But, you know, when we talk about trust and mutual respect, I think that's the foundation of every bilateral relationship in the world. It's the foundation of every personal relationship, I think, in the world. So I think you have to start there. But having a modicum of trust, being respectful, doesn't mean you have to pull your punches or be dishonest. I think Dr. Wu and I have been pretty honest here today. I think you've been maybe a little more honest than I have, but that's okay. This is your home turf. But in all seriousness, the importance is what do we do about it? I would say this too. I tried to be careful in my remarks. One of the reasons why I hesitated when Dan gave me this great honor of asking me to do this was these issues are so difficult and so emotional. I felt like I was going out on the high wire and I didn't want to fall off. But having come here and had this really rich discussion and getting all these great questions, I'm really glad that we've done it. I think we have to make one another uncomfortable. I think we have to speak the truth to power. And if we do it in a context where we're being respectful, I think that's fine. And again, I'll go back to the point that I was making about diplomacy. Someone asked me the other day, is it really worthwhile to have diplomacy with the Chinese? I think there are some friends in the United States who say that's a waste of time. You can tell I fundamentally disagree with that. I have great respect for my Chinese diplomatic counterparts. If I didn't have that respect, I wouldn't have wasted so much of my adult life talking with them and trying to work with them to manage this relationship to, at a minimum, prevent miscalculation and conflict, and maybe through hard work and some kind of mutual understanding, maybe do better and actually get something done positive. I've seen that between our presidents as well. We wouldn't waste our time negotiating with Chinese friends if we didn't think it was worthwhile and if we didn't think that the agreements that we concluded would be adhered to. If you ask diplomats on both sides, they'd probably say the record is not perfect on either side, but both sides still believe in doing it because of what I've said. There still is a modicum of respect. We have to preserve that, and if we do that, I still think we have a chance.
Okay, the last one. That lady, please, in pink.
Thank you for your comments. I'm Luca Berville. I study on exchange at Fudan, and I wanted to talk about the Russia-Ukraine war and whether you think this is going to be a subject on the agenda in the meeting coming up, and if so, under what would be the priorities for that, especially given the last attitude of President Trump towards Ukraine.
That's a great question. I do think it will be raised. I don't know exactly how it will be discussed. And here, I do want to be just very candid with Chinese friends. I have been deeply saddened and shocked by China's support of Russia in Ukraine, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. This is another difficult emotional issue and one which I've debated multiple times with Chinese diplomats. So I don't want to debate the issue necessarily. I just want to share with you that I think many of your American and European friends have been confused and saddened and angered to see China's support for Russia and Ukraine. And the reason the reasons are multiple. One, for me, I thought the 70-year tradition since China's founding was to hold respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations as something that was central to international relations. This was the most precious and sacred principle. And I feel like China has strayed from that in this instance in the name of advancing other interests. So that would be point one. Point two, it was striking to me during my last job, during which the Russian invasion of Ukraine occurred, it was striking to me how much European and Asian friends were united on supporting Ukraine. Why? Because I think friends in both Europe and Asia recognize that if any country in the world can redraw borders willy-nilly at their whim, I think the world becomes a very dangerous place. So I do think the issue will be raised. I don't know how it will be raised. You mentioned accurately that I think President Trump's own views on this issue are quite complex. But I do just want to state just how profoundly I think disconcerting China's policies on Ukraine have been. You'll recall that one of China's neighbors in the region said in the United States, Ukraine today, Asia tomorrow. And that's the concern. So I mentioned to the professor's question earlier, if I were advising Chinese leaders, I would just say, think about how your actions will be interpreted by others. I think that China's relationship with Europe has been particularly strained over this issue. I think it's been a source of tension in the U.S. China relationship, but also of deep concern to friends in Asia. I mentioned in my speech that I don't think I've ever met an Asian diplomat who wants to choose sides. Says, yeah, Kritenbrink, make me choose sides. I want to pick one or the other. That's not how countries think. But I do think many countries in the region are concerned if China supports Russia in invading its sovereign neighbor, what does that say about what China will do in the future? So those are the stakes. President Trump has said the issue is going to be discussed, so let's see what comes up.
I think when two leaders meet, President Trump will certainly come up with a Ukraine issue. I think the Chinese position would be the same as it has been over the years. China always support for peace and negotiation for an end to the conflict, unlike U.S. and some Western countries who at early stage just support Ukraine, fight and fight, don't stop. And now it realizes this is hopeless because it wanted to weaken Russia, it would be a hopeless effort. Now it began to talk about peace and negotiation. But the Chinese position has been always consistent: peace, negotiation, end of the conflict. Now, Dan just mentioned China's support for Russia. Well, if you check the record, I think our trade and other economic relations with Russia have been mostly non-military. We are not selling weapons to Russia. Basically, we conduct the normal trade relations with China. Is not something banned by the United Nations resolutions. So these pairs, in comparison to the U.S. support for Israel when it conducted the genocide in Gaza over the years. So, and also remember, if you ask China to stop trading with Russia because of the Ukraine conflict, you should also blame China for not cutting off its trade with the U.S. when the U.S. invaded Iraq during George W. Bush administration. That's not the Chinese policy.
Okay.
Can I make one No, I'm not going to win the debate. That's not my goal. I just do want to make one point. I remember my former boss, Secretary of State Blinken, used to say, if Russia were to stop fighting Ukraine tomorrow, the war would end. If Ukraine were to stop fighting tomorrow in the war, Ukraine would cease to exist. So this was not a war to try to keep Russia down. This is a war to try to preserve a sovereign nation. But yeah, I'll just make that, and then I'll stop.
Okay, time is very limited. I guess we should stop here. So please join me to thank Ambassador Kritenbrink and Professor Xinbo for their wonderful insights. And we should also thank Jan and Paul for making this lecture happen. So I finished the job as the moderator. Thank you all. Thank you.
Also Professor Wu and our colleagues at AmCham who've already been thanked, but the two people, I think it's two, who haven't been thanked are the interpreters who did a wonderful job, and we want to thank them.